It started on a warm Saturday morning, the kind of morning when the sunlight comes soft through the blinds and you almost believe the world outside is as calm as the air inside your living room. I was lacing up my sneakers, preparing to take my service dog, Grace, for her daily walk around the neighborhood. Grace wasn't just a dog, she was my lifeline. Every step I took outside my door, she was there, steady, alert, and grounding me when the world sometimes tilted in ways it shouldn't. We had a routine. The block around the HOA managed community was where I could breathe, where Grace could stretch her legs, and where neighbors waved in passing. But that morning, something told me it wouldn't be an ordinary walk. Halfway down the street, we passed by the corner where Mrs. Peterson lived. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. She was the type of woman who always seemed to be watching, like the HOA had given her a badge and a gun when really all she carried was judgment and entitlement. She had complained before about children playing too loudly, about people's lawns not being trimmed to her standard, even about Grace, claiming a dog had no place walking so close to her flower beds. But this morning, she wasn't just standing on her porch muttering under her breath. She was waiting. As Grace and I approached, I noticed the aerosol can in her hand. At first, I thought it was bug spray or maybe some lawn treatment. But as soon as we drew closer, she stepped forward with a suddenness that made my heart race. Before I could react, before I could shield Grace, a sharp mist burst from the can, spraying directly at her. Grace yelped, stammering backward, eyes blinking against the chemical assault. Time seemed to slow. My first instinct was to drop down, hold her, shield her, but then the reality hit me. This wasn't just cruelty. This was targeted. This was personal. "Get that mutt away from my yard!" Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the air, shrill, hard, and unforgiving. I stared at her, disbelief flooding me. "She's a service dog," I managed, my voice breaking with anger and fear. "You can't do that!" Grace pressed into my legs, trembling. My chest burned with a mix of rage and helplessness. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, my words tumbling out faster than my breath. The operator's calm tone was like a thread keeping me from unraveling. She promised an officer would be there soon. Minutes later, the flashing lights broke the stillness of the street. The officer stepped out, tall, steady, and serious. I explained what happened, my voice trembling but firm. Grace stayed close, still blinking through the sting of whatever was sprayed on her. Mrs. Peterson didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, standing defiantly, as though she believed she was in the right. "That animal doesn't belong out here," she said, her words sharp enough to cut glass. "It's a nuisance." The officer turned to her, his expression unchanging. "Ma'am, do you realize what you have just done?" She scoffed. "I sprayed a dog. What's the big deal?" That's when his tone shifted, measured, deliberate, and heavy with weight. "That is not just the dog. That's a federally protected service animal. Harming or interfering with the service animal is a federal crime." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the humidity that morning. Federal crime. I watched Mrs. Peterson's face freeze, her confidence cracking for the first time. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She had gone from self-appointed HOA enforcer to someone standing on the edge of serious consequences, and she knew it. For a moment, I just stood there, holding Grace close, trying to steady my own heartbeat. I thought about how often people like me, people who live in brown skin, have to fight twice as hard just to be heard, just to be respected. Too often we are treated like our pain has to be validated by someone else before it counts. And yet here, in this moment, there was no denying what had been done. The officer took my statement, asked me about Grace's role, about the tasks she performed. I explained how she guided me through moments of disorientation, how she helped me navigate spaces that sometimes felt overwhelming, and how she wasn't just an animal but a lifeline. He nodded, writing everything down carefully. Mrs. Peterson, meanwhile, had fallen into silence. Her eyes darted between me, Grace, and the officer, as if she was finally beginning to understand the gravity of what she had done. But there was no apology, no hint of remorse, just silence. I remember looking around at the neighbors who had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights. Some whispered, some shook their heads. A few caught my eye, sympathy etched on their faces, but none stepped forward. In that moment, I felt both seen and unseen. My pain public, but my humanity is still up for quiet judgment. Grace pressed against my leg, still trembling, but her trust in me unwavering. I bent down, whispering into her ear, promising her she was safe, that I would protect her as fiercely as she had always protected me. As the officer finished his notes, he looked back at me, steady and calm. He said, "This will be taken seriously. She needs to understand that actions like this have consequences." I nodded. Though part of me knew consequences often fall differently depending on who you are, justice doesn't always move the same way for everyone. But in that moment, hearing the words federal crime spoken aloud in front of her was enough to remind me that what happened mattered, that Grace's suffering mattered, that my dignity mattered. The officer's words stayed with me long after the patrol car pulled away. Federal crime. They echoed in my chest, bouncing between disbelief and a fragile sense of vindication. For years, I had grown used to the small indignities that came with living in that neighborhood. The stares that lasted too long, the whispers when my family hosted gatherings, the quiet way people crossed the street rather than share the same sidewalk. But what happened that morning wasn't subtle. It was violence. It was an attack on Grace, and by extension, on me. That night, as I cleaned Grace's eyes gently with the solution the vet recommended, I thought about how much she had given me. She had been trained to steady my steps when vertigo made the world spin, to interrupt the dark spirals that sometimes pulled me under. She had been my anchor, my protector, my silent witness in a world that often refused to see me. And someone had looked at her, all her loyalty, all her service, and decided she was nothing more than a nuisance to be sprayed down like weeds on the edge of a driveway. News travels fast in communities like ours. By the next morning, whispers had grown into full-on debates. Some neighbors stopped me on the street, their voices hushed but urgent. "We saw what happened. We're so sorry," they said. Their eyes carried pity, sometimes outrage, but rarely action. Others kept their distance, peeking through blinds as if acknowledging the incident too openly might invite conflict. But what happened that morning wasn't subtle. It was violence. It was an attack on Grace, and, by extension, on me. That night, as I cleaned Grace's eyes gently with the solution the vet recommended, I thought about how much she had given me. She had been trained to steady my steps when vertigo made the world spin, to interrupt the dark spirals that sometimes pulled me under. She had been my anchor, my protector, my silent witness in a world that often refused to see me. And someone had looked at her, all her loyalty, all her service, and decided she was nothing more than a nuisance to be sprayed down like weeds on the edge of a driveway. The HOA held an emergency meeting a few days later. I didn't want to go, but something inside me told me I needed to be there, to speak not just for Grace, but for myself. The room was filled with the usual faces, the ones who like to police the length of grass and the shade of paint on shutters, but this time the conversation was different. The incident had forced them to confront something they couldn't ignore. Mrs. Peterson sat near the back, stiff and silent, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, but not repentant, just cornered. When the floor opened for discussion, I stood, Grace steady at my side. My voice trembled at first, but then steadied as I spoke. I live here just like all of you. I pay my dues, I follow the rules, I take care of my home. But last week, my service animal was attacked, sprayed with chemicals for simply walking by. That wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a violation of federal law. And more than that, it was a violation of my dignity. When you attack a service animal, you're attacking the person who depends on them. You're telling them they don't belong. The room was quiet when I finished. The kind of quiet that comes when people know truth has been spoken and can't be undone. A few nodded, a few looked away, but no one challenged me, not this time. The HOA president cleared his throat, fumbling for words. We, of course, take this very seriously, he said, his voice stiff. We'll be reviewing appropriate actions. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall of silence that usually protected people like Mrs. Peterson. The police report moved forward. An investigator called me to follow up, asking for details, medical records from the vet, even photos of Grace's reddened eyes. Every step of that process reminded me that this wasn't just personal, it was bigger. It was about what it means to live with dignity, about whether the law protects all of us equally. Grace recovered slowly, her eyes healing, her steps regaining their steady rhythm. But for me, the wound went deeper. I kept replaying that moment when the officer said the words federal crime, and the look on Mrs. Peterson's face froze. For once, the shield of entitlement she carried had cracked. She had looked for just a second, like someone realizing the world wasn't hers to control. I thought of my ancestors, of all the times Black men and women had been made to feel small, invisible, or less than human in the very places they called home. And I thought of how each act of resistance, each refusal to be silent, was part of a much longer struggle. My fight for Grace wasn't separate from that. It was woven into the same fabric. Weeks passed, and the community settled into its uneasy quiet. Mrs. Peterson avoided me, no longer standing on her porch to glare as I passed. Some neighbors offered small kindnesses, a nod, a word of support. Others stayed distant, unwilling to pick sides. But I had already decided something important. Silence would not be my side. Grace and I continued our walks. Every step past that corner was an act of defiance, a declaration that we belonged. Every time her paws touched the pavement, every time I held my head high, I was saying, we are here and we will not be erased. Justice doesn't always come in the way we hope. Maybe Mrs. Peterson would face charges, maybe she wouldn't. Maybe the HOA would hold her accountable, maybe they'd bury it under paperwork and bureaucracy. But what mattered most was that the truth had been spoken out loud, that the harm had been named, and that someone like me refused to shrink in the face of it. Grace looked up at me one morning as we rounded that same corner, her eyes bright, her steps confident again. I smiled through the ache in my chest, because in that moment, I knew, no matter how much hate tried to strip us of dignity, resilience would always rise louder. And dignity, ours, was something no spray, no glare, no silence could take away.